Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writers Center. More importantly for this chat, I am a fiction writer and a novelist, and so I'm really excited to dive into the craft of this novel because it's just really interesting in so many ways and is, anyway, it's just been a joy to read. So everyone, please, I'm gonna hold up the book again. Please check out Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. And Rita, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and being our guest. And I'm wondering if you have your book handy, if you could maybe just read a brief excerpt so everyone will have an idea of what we're talking about today.
Sure, and thank you, Zach, for inviting me for this conversation. I'm going to read just like a few short paragraphs because I sometimes start tuning out when readings go on too long online, so we'll keep it short. This is from a battle scene toward the end. Okay. Another blast rocked the ship, a solid hit this time. It threw her to the deck and slid her several paces. Her elbows bore the brunt of the impact, and she felt skin scraping away from bone as she tried to stop her momentum with only her arms. What actually stopped her was the body of one of her best men. She pushed herself upright, hands slipping around on the bloody deck. And that might have been the moment, or maybe the moment right after, when Sekyung noticed the new wave of Portuguese boarding, that she realized she might well lose everything today. Death crept along the ship like poison vines, clambering onto one person, and then another, making blood blossom from chests and bellies and mouths. It sprouted shoots below decks. Out of the corner of her eye, Sekyung saw Yen Yen lunge at a man with her spear and get knocked against the wall. The spear fell. Yen Yen hadn't been able to make the kill, she realized. The girl had hesitated, and that was the opening the enemy needed. Sekyung elbowed her way closer, but the northern woman got there first, throwing herself at the man who towered over Yen Yen. He stumbled, and his blade carved Yen Yen's arm open. I'll just stop right there.
Oh, there's action scenes. I should have had some action scene questions because there's so much good action writing in this as well, but perhaps maybe someone in the chat will have a great question about action scenes, and I can take advantage of that if you write one. So in your own words, who the heck are you?
Who the heck am I? That is an existential question. I am somebody who came to writing slightly later in life. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I actually worked as a psychologist for many years before I finally went back to school to do my MFA. I was a practicing psychologist. I was a faculty member at a university teaching psychology. And one day I kind of said, I've been writing since I was a teenager. What if I actually what if I actually took my writing seriously and started submitting and doing all the things that a writer's supposed to do? So I did my MFA, and during the MFA, I worked on mostly short stories, as a lot of MFA students do. And then after I finished my program, I started working on this novel. And I feel like at heart, I am a giant nerd. I am one of the people who has been working on reclaiming the word nerd from, from the negative connotations that it had when I was growing up. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, I love beautiful prose and beautiful writing, but I also just like really nerdy things about, like pirates, and I love science fiction and fantasy. And so this novel also has fantastic elements as well.
I was just watching Strange New Worlds on the Star Trek on before this event, so I will join you in nerddom. We'll have a nerd chat later.
Sure.
But yeah, so that's really great. And I want to go to our first and often our hardest question for our guests, but hopefully it's not too hard for you, which is, what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before?
I think that I would like somebody to ask me and then make sure that I answer honestly about my revision process. Because I think that there's a kind of adage in writing that you should like crank out the first draft, right? It doesn't matter if it's crap. You crank out your shitty first draft. Sorry for the language, and you just revise it again until you feel like it's actually in a shape to go out into the world. And my revision process is actually a little bit different from other folks. And when people do ask me about the revision process, I always feel like I have to lie a little bit. Like I always feel like I have to say like, oh yeah, this, like this book went through many, many drafts before. But the truth is I'm somebody who tends to revise a lot as I go. I am, and if the cranking out a first draft strategy works for you, that's awesome, right? Like we all got to do what works for us in our lives. But for me, that's never quite worked because my brain gets too caught on sort of like, oh, but I know that this doesn't work. So, if I'm in the middle of writing something and an idea occurs to me or some kind of incongruency occurs to me, I can't just keep writing. I have to go back to my earlier chapters and fix the things that are incongruent with the thing that I'm writing now. So yeah, I don't know. I think that there are some writers out there with this kind of a revision process, but I tend to turn out relatively clean first drafts, not because I'm awesome, but because my first draft is, something that I've actually gone through many, many times before I got to the end of the draft.
I love that you said that. I think it's so important to any question of process should always have like the asterisk or whatever works for you, because it's everyone like, yes, that lots of people do like the rough first draft and really work on it afterwards, but some people have to revise along the way or they just can't. Anyway, process is something you got to figure out on your own. You can't borrow it from someone else. So I'm really glad you said that one. So one of the things that was really, really striking about the novel to me was the use of flashbacks. Uses flashbacks really well and on a couple scales. First, there are the traditional flashback chapters where we maybe step away from the action for a chapter of the narrative present to learn more about Shek-Young's past. And then there are smaller moments of flashback sort of interspersed throughout chapters as well. And those so often are really hard to do, and they just sort of happen seamlessly here and don't interrupt flow, and it flows really, really nice. So I'm really curious about this. So how do you manage flashback in a way that enhances rather than disrupts the narrative?
I think I think my answer to that question would differ depending on what kind of narrator I'm using. I think that I've attempted writing more like pulled back omniscient narrators before, and I think you can get away with certain things with like omniscient narrators that you can't. There are pros and cons to every POV, but when I'm writing very close into one particular character, as I am in this case, like this entire novel is told from Shek-Young's perspective, then usually I think the question that I ask myself is, would it be reasonable that this character would be thinking about this past event right now? It's like I don't generally go around thinking about, let's say, my best friend from high school, but like every now and then I'll encounter somebody with a name that's very similar to hers or something. And something in the environment is triggering me to remember or to reminisce about this person. And so I think when I was writing when I write flashbacks in general, I'm always asking myself, does it make sense that this person would be thinking about this thing at this moment? And if the answer is no, then that flashback doesn't go there. And then I think another question that I ask myself is this present moment, or I should say, does the flashback provide important context for the present moment? And if it doesn't, then usually I'll cut it because, it's, let's say the character is in the middle of a very tense situation, right? Like you don't want to undercut the tension. And also it's like, if the flashback doesn't give you context for what is happening right now, then I feel like it's not really doing as much work as it could be. And so I think those are the questions that I tend to try to ask myself. Would the character be thinking this right now? And does this flashback provide necessary context? And if it's no on either of those two counts, then usually I don't put a flashback in there.
I love the environment triggers the flashback. I think that's just such a key moment that if it happens organically because something in the environment, it would trigger in this character the moment of reflection. So that's really fascinating. And I'm going to write an essay on it, I think. So I'll give you full credit. But that's really interesting. So the other really striking thing to me, or one of the other striking things, was I think you have like something we maybe don't talk about enough, but that there's a really great variety in chapter length and the large scale rhythm of the novel. There's a satisfying variety of chapter lengths. Chapters that range from a couple up to a handful of pages are interspersed among longer chapters. In particular, I love the interstitial chapters about the goddess Mazu, which was really interesting to me. So broadly, what makes a chapter a chapter? Why does something begin and end when it does and gets a page break and a new number at the top of the next page?
I think for the Mazu chapters, those were a little bit simpler because I based those on actual myths. And so the chapter begins where the myth begins and the chapter ends where the myth ends. I mean, obviously, I added a bunch of stuff in the middle. I had to kind of expand on the myth. Sometimes with some of these myths, like if you look them up in a book, it's like 3 sentences. It's Mazu did this and the end. And so that wasn't going to make for very good reading. So, but the beginnings and ends, I don't think there's a single myth in there where I decided to begin it or end it at a different place. And part of that, I mean, we don't have to get into it, but part of that is that I do think that I do feel some duty to respect that Mazuism is still a religion that's alive and well in many parts of Asia. And, there are people who live their lives by these myths. And so I didn't want to corrupt them, too deeply, because I didn't want to offend the people who actively practice. But so with the Mazu chapters, it was a kind of like, simple decision. I think with the other chapters, I personally, and this is just my own opinion, I'm sure that there are other kind of, preferences on this, but I personally really like it when at the end of a chapter, there's a sense that something has changed. It doesn't need to be a massive change, but there needs to be a sense that something has shifted, even if it's just slightly. And like there's something that I like to say to my students sometimes, which is that, I think the best novel endings are the endings that close the door but open a window. I don't like endings that feel too everything's neatly tied up and because I don't think that's how life works. I think in life we rarely get everything neatly tied up, but at the same time I get I feel dissatisfied if I read an entire book and the ending is completely loosey-goosey. And so I love it when an ending is like the image that keeps coming to my mind is like you close the door, but you open a window, you leave some room for the future, for what might happen after. And so kind of by that logic, I feel like chapter endings, it's you need to keep the door open because the main plot is still happening, the story is still happening, but it's almost like maybe like you keep the door open but you like slide a screen door closed or something like that. There's been some kind of change, but the air, the whatever is still flowing through the main door. I don't know if that's like too weird or convoluted an analogy, but that's kind of how I think of novel endings as well as chapter endings.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I liked the analogy, so it worked for me. Just in terms of varying chapter length, was that something you were conscious of doing intentionally to make sure that you maybe so that sort of like you'd look at sentences within a paragraph, you wouldn't want all your sentences the same length. Were you considering chapters in sort of the same way?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. I mean, I think that the human attention span is much more fragile than we would like to admit that it is. I mean, I think the pandemic taught a lot of us a lot of things about what happens to our attention spans and when we're stressed. So I do try to vary up chapter lengths because I think it can be very easy to fall into this plotting. You don't want everything to feel too zippy, but at the same time, you don't want things to start feeling like they're plotting. And so I personally find that varying up chapter lengths tends to create more of a sense of dynamism in the book.
How do you see, because one of the things that's interesting to me is always juxtaposition, and especially a fable or a religious story next to a bloody battle. You might get something. How do you decide where maybe one of those Ma Zu stories comes in? Is it very deliberate? Do you deliberately choose where it fits because of thematic resonances with what's on either side of it?
Yeah, for the most, I would say for like 90% of the stories, it was thematic resonance. So, like if there's one Ma Zu story about childbirth, for example, or about Ma Zu herself being born, then that would, to me, that felt very natural coming either before or after. I forget which order I used, but like it would belong next to a chapter in which the main character is thinking about childbirth. I think one of the final Ma Zu stories, I think I deliberately chose to put that there because that was a moment of emotional reckoning because of what's happening in the story. Like it's a moment of emotional reckoning for Sekyung. And I thought that given that this whole time throughout the book, these Ma Zu myths have been, sort of like a counterbalance, or I don't know what the word is, like something to help clarify Sekyung's mental and emotional state. I felt like, okay, I feel like something deserves to go here to help make sense of Sekyung's emotional reactions and thoughts in the situation that she's in. So yeah.
Great. So I had a few questions in the chat so far. So I'm going to do one of those right now. You mentioned your MFA earlier, and someone's wondering, did you feel the MFA helped you, or could you have done without it, without the structure of a program?
That is a great question. And I think that, so for me personally, the MFA was really helpful. The MFA, first of all, introduced me to writers that I think I wouldn't have discovered otherwise. Like you have all these really brilliant faculty members who are like, oh, you should read this person. You should read. And in fact, I've like some of my favorite writers currently working today, I discovered when I was in the program. And we all know that reading great writers, especially writers who are not maybe so publicly, who are not incredibly well known, like I think that in and of itself greatly improves your writing, just reading these people. And then on top of that, I think the MFA program taught me to be a little bit less precious about my writing. I had a faculty member who like was the consensus, so it wasn't just me, like the consensus was that he was not he didn't pull his punches when it came to feedback. But like a really good lesson that I took away from working with that particular faculty member was like, you write something and it can be easy to get really emotionally attached to it and say like, oh, I never, I don't want to change a single word. But ultimately, the favorite thing, one of his favorite things to say was like, nothing, I forget, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, nothing is ever lost. So the idea is you write something and maybe you have to cut it for this story or this novel. Maybe it doesn't work for this particular piece of writing in this moment, but it's not lost. Like the fact that you wrote it, that means that, or at least this is how I chose to interpret it. That means that it might have another life at some point in the future in another piece of writing, because it is now a part of your repertoire. And so I think, yeah, between reading really great people that I don't think I would have discovered otherwise, and learning to be less protective of my writing, I think that those were the really helpful things. The structure thing, I've heard different things from different people. I do know I have friends who say that without the structure of an MFA, they wouldn't have been able to finish their books. But I also have friends who, like the second they finished their MFA, they stopped writing because, like, I think that ultimately you have to be able to instill, you have to be able to impose some kind of structure on yourself, because you can't stay in the MFA forever, right? Like, you might have structure while you're in the program, but if you don't have the structure after the program is over, what are you going to do then? So yeah, I think the structure thing I think it can be helpful, but then you need to like set certain habits in place that you're going to stick with after you're done.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. I have a personal belief that all fiction to a certain extent contains autobiographical elements from the author's life. How true is this in your experience, and particularly in this book, which is historical fiction? Is there any example you might pull from that?
I mean, I think it's true that ultimately everything, I'm trying to think of a good way to put this. We're always going to be projecting ourselves onto other people, right? Like, I mean, that's not just in writing, that's in everyday life. I mean, this is a classic concept in psychology, right? That we project onto people. Like, we see somebody, we go, oh, that person must be like, X, Y, and Z. And very often it's not because that person is X, Y, and Z. It's because we've projected certain elements that we don't like about ourselves or whatever onto that person. So given that that's the same in life, I can't imagine why it would be different for writing. And I do think that I can definitely, I think that for the most part, I try to write Sek-Young as a person who is separate from myself based on, the oral records that exist about her, based on the stories that have been told about her. But at the same time, there are going to be things that I can't help it. They were projections of myself, So one thing that I've shared in the past. So this isn't like groundbreaking news, but like I'm a survivor of sexual assault, and there is a scene of sexual. So I guess trigger warning, content warning for people. There's a scene in there, and ultimately, I think people are going to have different reactions and memories, and if you've experienced assault, your experience of it may not be exactly the same as other people's. Like, sometimes there's similarities, but like sometimes things can be quite different. So ultimately, I was drawing upon my own experiences writing that scene of sexual assault compared with, I don't know, like, so I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think it was very good. All right, I can go back to my questions for just a second, because I did want to talk about characterization, which seems tied into what we were just talking about a little bit there. Was so the main players in the novel are really just many layered. They're very interesting, and thinking of your psychological background now, I bet you I'm not sure I can see that, but I'm like, oh yeah, that's probably a strength and that's why this felt so good in the writing. But I'd like to talk about how you think about characterization. So starting with the protagonist, Sek-Young. She's powerful and vicious, but also vulnerable and affectionate in her own way. So how did she go from being an idea for a character, for being this historical figure, maybe without that can't really be fleshed out in the historical record, to being a person on the page?
So I'm somebody who tends to figure characters out as I'm writing them, and again, that's just my particular way of working. Some people figure everything, about their characters out beforehand. And again, if that works for you, great, But for me, it took, I think I think I was well into my second draft when I finally had a better sense of who she was as a character. When I go back and read my first draft, there was a way in which she felt a little bit, she felt a little bit just like a psychopath, for lack of a better way of putting it, and then so in the second draft, I was like, okay, well, my goal isn't to write like, if I were writing like Silence of the Lambs, right? If I were writing a Hannibal Lecter type of character, that might be fine, but that's not what I'm going for with this particular novel. And so I was like, okay, we need to find ways to show that she has all of these aspects of cruelty about her. Absolutely. Like, I never want to downplay the cruelty that she exhibited. But at the same time, I think that like, I mean, like some really, really terrible people, like sometimes they still have people they care about. It just, they don't care about 99% of the population. They care about like the 3 people in their family or whatever, So I had to kind of like think about the ways in which she could be soft, in addition to all of the ways that she was hard in her work and in her life. And so that, I want to say like it was the second draft when I finally started going, okay, we need to complexify her a little bit more.
So I guess we haven't really covered this. You say you generally, your first draft is pretty complete in a lot of ways. We now know that there's some characterization going in second drafts.
Yeah.
Is there much pre-planning? Are you an outliner? You outline characters? Do you like sketch things beforehand, or do you just sort of go into the thing and figure it out as you go along?
I do like a very rough sketch before. Like I needed to know her life story first. And then as I was writing it, I kind of like filled in details based on the aspects of her life that I knew about. So I would say I'm more, like if I had to give you a percentage, I would say I'm more like 40-60. Like I plan out about 40% of it, and then the other 60% of it I discover as we go along.
Back to characters real quickly for one more question is, so many of these characters, I mean, we saw the scene of a bloody battle. These characters are engaging in some pretty messed up stuff. So
Yeah.
how do you approach the moral gray areas of a fictional soul? So what's the role of the author in presenting such characters? Are you a neutral bystander? Are you a judge and jury? Are you a bearer of opinions? How do you place yourself as author / narrator / what these characters are in terms of their morality?
That is a really great question. And I'll be honest that I'm of a few different minds about this. I mean, I will just say that I don't think it is the job of fiction to educate people on morality. Like I mean, like if you need a book or an author to tell you that murder is wrong, like we are in much worse shape as a society than we thought, right? Like, so I don't think it's the job of like we're not writing Aesop's fables or whatever. Our goal is not to like, right. At the same time, I do think there is, I wouldn't say responsibility, but I do think it makes for much better fiction. It makes for much more interesting fiction if we can explore the ways in which human beings put themselves through these kind of like moral contortions in order to justify their own behaviors, right? So something I really, really try to do, I was, as an author, I wasn't going to, be putting in the book like Sekyung realized that murdering was wrong, but like I think there is a way in which I was like, okay, well, assuming that she wasn't a psychopath, but just a person who found herself in really difficult circumstances, what kind of logical contortions and sort of what kind of excuses does she need to make for herself in order to, I think most of us ultimately just don't want to believe that we're bad people, right? So like, what would somebody who doesn't want to believe that she's a bad person, but who's doing tons of terrible things, how would she justify things to herself? And so I'm hoping that in putting a spotlight on some of these logical contortions, we can, I hope readers will kind of like realize that we all have these ways in which we try to justify to ourselves the bad stuff that we've done, and maybe the stuff we've done is nowhere near the same caliber as what she's done, but that there is still a way that we all kind of, that we do things that we're not entirely proud of, and then we try to explain it away, we try to rationalize it away, and I do hope that that's one of the things that people think about as they read the book.
I love you use the phrase moral contortions, characters making moral contortions. I really love that concept. Is sort of what we're doing as authors. We're making these characters perform. We don't necessarily making a judgment on those, but we do need to make them make the contortions to twist themselves to the situations around them. So that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. So quick mid-event reminder to please get a copy of the book. You can do so from your local independent bookseller or online from bookshop.org or any various online sellers. I forgot to mention earlier that Yuko Shimizu is one of my favorite authors. We have a print over, right? I could turn the camera and show up. It's pretty far away, so I won't do that. But yes, she's one of our favorite authors. So as Yuko gets a cover, you've already half won me to read the book. So
yeah, no, Yuko is absolutely amazing, and I cannot believe that we were able to get her to do the cover. And she was actually also sweet enough to come to an event of mine in New York.
oh, that's
So
great.
it was, I was really touched. Yeah,
That's great. So back to the chat window. I've seen a few more questions come in. So a question of curiosity. I'm going to paraphrase this one a little bit because I think this is your first book, and it was saying from the time of publishing your first book, how long would you say it took for you to be recognized on a larger scale, and what contributed to that recognition? So I'd say maybe first book, but also maybe your first publications in journals, your individual story publications and smaller piece publications. And how do you feel? How recognized are you, and how did that process of recognition progress for you?
I'm not recognizable at all. I mean, like, if I wanted to be like, paparazzi famous, I would have tried to get into acting or something. I mean, like, I think that most of us as writers, we kind of acknowledge that a far smaller slice of the population reads fiction than we would like. And so if your goal was breakaway kind of worldwide success, I mean, unless you like write the Hunger Games or something like that, like the chances of you becoming any kind of recognizable is really slim. So I'm sorry if I'm like bursting anyone's bubbles, but like that's just something you have to accept if you're in the field. But yeah, I mean, in a way, I think publishing short stories kind of prepared me for being unrecognized, if that makes any sense. Because
That's true.
well, folks who've written short stories, I mean, like these literary journals, I mean, first of all, the people who work on these journals are doing God's work. Like, I mean, it's so much effort for like so little pay and so little recognition. But if you get to publish your short stories in these, you feel like the people who pick up literary journals are the people that you want to be your audience, if that like makes sense. Like these are usually people who really care about writing and care about craft and all of these things. So yeah, I mean, I got stories published, and like maybe a few more people knew who I was, but like ultimately I recognized that literary journals are not the most far-ranging in terms of like scope and in terms of audience. They're not the most wide-ranging.
You say too, if you're able to subscribe to a literary journal, pick one that you like and do it. They're amazing people. Do a little research, find one, ask around. If you don't know any, they are a great way to support the literary community.
Yeah.
All right.
If I can add something to
Yes.
that. One strategy that I use to decide which ones I want to submit to, or which ones I want to subscribe to as well as submit to, is if you have a favorite short story collection, like let's say you're reading like a Karen Russell collection and you're like, oh my God, this story is amazing. Basically go to the back, and the back of the book usually will tell you which story was first published in what journal. So if you really loved a story that you saw in a collection, look at it, publishes the kind of stuff that you would want to read more of. So I'm just going to throw that out there.
Absolutely. And kudos for the Karen Russell shout out too, because I shout out Karen Russell at least every other craft chat I pull. Yeah. Back to the chat window. Speaking of short stories, how was it going from short stories to a novel?
It was hard. It was hard. I think at heart, I still feel very much like a short story writer. And I think that's just because I spent years and years writing short stories before I turned my attention to novels. And so that's always felt, the short story world has always felt like my home. And when I had to start writing a novel, I mean, notice the language that I just used there. I wasn't even intentional. When I had to start writing a novel, right? Like that there was the sense of, I have to write a novel because nobody publishes short story collections unless they're a company. I mean, like if you get like, you know, your story in the New Yorker and it goes viral, then sure, they'll publish a short story collection, but it's hard to just publish a single short story collection without a novel. So that's kind of how I thought of it at the beginning, that, oh, you know, it's this thing that I have to do. It's like a writerly rite of passage. And then after I started working on the novel, I kind of discovered that there was a different kind of joy in working on the long form, right? Like that there were things that I could do in the long form that there's just not room. Like I can't retell every single Mazu myth in a single short story. Like nobody would read that, you know? And so so like there are ways it's like, okay, if I want to explore an idea in depth, if I want to play with some, you know, weird formal elements or recursions or whatever, the novel is a much better suited, the novel is much better suited for it. So I had to kind of, I guess you can say I fell in love with short stories quickly, whereas for novels, it was more of a slow burn before I realized that I had feelings for it.
Is there a short story collection in the works, perhaps?
There is, but I'm not sure I should say
Okay.
anything.
Okay, we're going to let that go. We're going to let that drop. I didn't ask that question. It never happened.
Cool.
So I saw in your previous answer, you said, use the phrase had to write a novel. And maybe I noticed the psychologist coming out a little bit as you caught yourself saying that. And someone's next question is, how did your career in psychology may have contributed to your writing? How does that influence you as a writer?
I think that, so I think that's something, there's something about spending all your time listening to other people and then paying attention to every little verbal, you know, paying attention to every little verbal tick, paying attention to every nonverbal gesture. There's something about living like that that I think translates well to novel writing, because you have to be, I think ultimately the best novelists are good at observing the world, you know, like even if they're writing a world that's not a realistic world, right? Like they could be writing about, you know, galaxy far, far away. But like the point is that there has to be some element of looking at the outside world and realizing the ways in which your own biases and your own thoughts are distorting or refracting what you're seeing from the outside world. I don't know if that makes any sense. And so I think it just, all of the time that I spent doing that, I would like to think it was good training for eventually writing this book. Yeah.
Great. So back to the chat window. Would you change the way you became an author? Like, what do you wish you would have done differently, or advice you would give to authors who are just beginning that they want to pursue writing?
I mean, the main advice I would say is that you just have to keep, I mean, and everybody says this, but everybody says this because it's true. It's going to be just a ton of rejections in the beginning. That's just how, you know, like I think only in very rare instances do you somehow achieve acclaim overnight. But most people, you know, they submit a bunch of stories, they get all of them rejected, and then they keep going. So as much as I didn't like that piece of advice when I was starting out, I've been forced to acknowledge that that's basically like a good piece of advice, that you just have to kind of keep doing it despite the fact that you're going to be getting rejected a lot. And, you know, it's okay to acknowledge that you're hurt by it, right? Like, I think sometimes there's this idea that writers should all be these very thick-skinned, you know, like we were like covered in calluses, like so that like nothing can hurt us. But like, no, like you're a human being. It hurts when you get rejected, and that's okay. It's okay to mourn when you know, something doesn't work out the way that you hoped. But ultimately, after you mourn, you still need to keep writing and keep submitting, because that's the only thing that's going to put your work out there. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question? You might have to repeat it. Sorry about that.
It was, would you change the way you became an author, was the first part of that question.
some days I think yes, and some days I think no. Like right now I'm thinking, I had been writing since I was in college, but the kind of writing that I did back then, like I hadn't grown into myself as a person yet. Like I don't really think I personally, I don't think I had a good sense of who I was as a person, and then certainly not who I was as a writer until I was in my late 20s, I want to say. And so even if I had started writing earlier, like honestly, I would be embarrassed if like some of my writing from like when I was in college somehow got out into the world, because I think I was just a very different person then. But so I personally wouldn't change it, because I feel like I finally have reached it kind of like an emotional maturity level where I can put something out in the world that I'm not going to be terribly embarrassed by later. But some days some days I'm like, oh, this would be so much easier if I had started when I was just in my 20s, because then I wouldn't constantly feel like I'm playing a game of catch up. Like there are all these awards that are like, oh, you have the writers under 35, right? Writers under 40. And it's like, oh, I've been automatically, so I'm 40 by, sorry. But like there's a way in which like you're automatically locked out of all of them, the second you read. And so like sometimes I think, well, if I had started earlier, then maybe I would have a better shot at some of these things. But, hindsight's 2020.
Also, you never know how the experiences you had have actually strengthened you as a writer. And as someone who was also a slightly later in life writer, that yeah, definitely though don't want anyone to read anything I wrote before like a certain age. Fortunately, being in one's 40s means you don't have too many artifacts in the internet for people to dig up. That's going to be the greatest joy of being an elder millennial.
This is true, because like something that I don't think like live journal, is that still on? Like now I need to make sure like all my old live journal posts have been taken down. All right.
Oh, all right. So I haven't I forgot to scroll down and find more. So from Erica, the action, the fight scenes. Yes, I'm glad this question's being asked. On a technical level, did you have a particular method for managing the action on the page, keeping track of who is stabbing who, what ship is where, things like that? I love keeping track of who is stabbing who. I'm writing that down too.
Yes. I think, okay, so the long answer, Erica, to your question is that I read a lot of wuxia novels as a kid. So for the folks who don't know, wuxia novels are martial arts novels written usually in Chinese. And so Chinese was my first language before I learned English. And so when I was growing up, I read all of my grandfather's wuxia novels. And I think those books, by the way, I think many of them have been translated into English for folks who are interested. But those books taught me so much about how to write a fight scene, because that's literally all the characters do. Like every book is like, this character needs to avenge this person, and now they need to start training, and then they, training, they have to fight this person, and then they have to fight this person. And I think one of the things that I took away from reading so many of those books when I was younger is that fight scenes should be really multifaceted. Like it shouldn't just be like he punched, she kicked. Like if then you just end up with a bunch of like verbs, you know what I mean? Like of like people doing things. And that you also need to think about the larger scene, like you're doing something here, but unless this is like a boxing situation, which there are only two people fighting, if this is like an all-out fight involving lots of people, then you need to be thinking about like who's standing where and how these people might interact with your main character, who's fighting, at the moment. And so I think a lot of it was like trying to, like sometimes I would draw little diagrams. I would be like, okay, like here's the ship. All right, this is where they go below decks, this is where she's standing, this is where this person's standing. And then thinking about like, oh, there's a scene toward the end, like if you've ever been if you've ever been below decks on a ship, how cramped it is. I mean, these weren't like the giant cruise liners back that we have these days, right? These were like much smaller ships. And so trying to use like a spear right, below decks is a bad idea. You do not want to use anything that will greatly restrict your range of motion. So I had to do a lot of like place setting when writing these scenes, figuring out people and how people would be interacting with the particular environmental context that they're in. Erica, does that answer your question?
You just said that, yes, they were hoping there were diagrams
Yes,
involved.
there are always diagrams involved.
And I also think there's a poetry of action. There's language that you don't get to use in other places that you get to use when action's going on. So it's a whole new area of language and writing you get to play with if you go into a scene that has some action like that. How often do you get to write cutlass unless you're writing a scene where they're using cutlasses? I mean, it's like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, again, this might sound obvious, but I think sometimes I know sometimes I forget it, but like writing should be fun, right? I mean, I'm not saying writing isn't at times painful. Like sometimes it involves, us like looking deep within ourselves and, like digging up things that we would rather do. So like writing can be a lot of things, but I think at the very least, it should sometimes be fun. And so why not lean into it? You know what I mean? Like if you're going to write a scene with a cutlass, go all out, have somebody swing that thing around.
Great. So my next topic was just sort of the differentiation in fiction of fact versus truth. My novel is an alternate history, but it has lots of historical details in it, and it was based on lots of research. But I certainly, people seemed really interested in what the factual parts of my novel were, which of course I didn't care about really at all when I was writing the novel, like, oh, this is a fun fact, I'm going to use it. But broadly, what's your relationship to what really happened, to what's from the historical record, and sort of what's your threshold of accuracy when telling historical details, and how much did you let yourself maybe diverge from what facts there were for the purposes of telling a good story, writing a good novel?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually you said it best yourself when you sent me the list of questions beforehand. I think that there's a difference between fact and truth. And I think that for me, and again, folks are allowed to disagree with me on this, but like my personal philosophy is that truth is important. Fact is, like sometimes you can lie a little bit if it serves the larger truth of the story or of the world. So, this is a bad example, but I would never write a version of this novel in which the women had, unless this were an alternate history thing, but like if I were writing about this actual historical period, I would never write a version of this novel in which the women had the same kind of rights as the men and never got harassed and never got, never got harassed, never got discriminated against, because that would fly against the truth of this period of history, which was to say women had much fewer rights than men did. However, fact, like if whether a battle takes place in, actually took place in 1809 versus 1810, like stuff like that, I really couldn't care less about. And so yeah, I think I was constantly asking myself, like, does this actually violate the truth, or is this just bending the facts a little bit? And if it violates truth with a capital T, then I personally, I didn't feel comfortable going against that.
Yeah. And related to that too, I mean, there is in this setting, there's a lot of education that most readers are going to need to be able to understand the story. So how do you balance including the facts and the details that are necessary, and educating a reader with telling a good story? How do you keep something compelling while you're also having to share? You have to share information. There's information you need to share for this to work, and more so than maybe something set in New York City present day. So how did you balance keeping details forthcoming, but also the story moving forward?
I mean, it was a little bit of trial and error, to be honest. Like and look, nobody writes a novel on their own, right? You have an agent who helps you get it ready for submission. You have an editor, if you're ready, if you get it accepted for publication, you have an editor whose job it is to now help you do. So I don't want to pretend like I figured everything out myself. There were many instances in the novel where I wrote something, and my editor was like, I'm not entirely sure we need this, like this might be a little bit too much detail and it gets in the way of the larger narrative. Or sometimes there were places where my editor would come back to me and say like, actually, I don't think I have a very clear idea in my head of what this is supposed to look like, or like what it smells like, or and so and that's the beauty of being able to work with a good editor, right? It's hard to kind of have that kind of impartiality about your own work, but like the editor can, and also because you've done all the research, so like it's kind of clear to you what you should know, but the editor didn't do all this research, so they'll tell you like, oh, actually, as somebody who didn't do any of this research on whatever 1800s weapons, what is this supposed to be like, and do we even need to talk that much about it?
So moving to details real quick, how do you select details and what gets to stay? Because I sort of sometimes think about details in the way, something we talk about a lot in dialogue is that it needs to be doing more than one thing at once. It can't just, and I sort of feel the same way about details, and I bring it up here because I do feel like that you have details that are very clearly orienting me in a space beautifully, but I also feel like those details are selected to do more than that. So I'm just wondering how you think about detail and selecting details and the work that detail does when it is included.
I think my answer for this is a little bit similar to your question earlier, my answer for your question about flashbacks, which is to say, is this a detail that this particular character would notice at this point in time? Because I know I personally, I tend to get a little bit bristly when I'm reading something, and it's like somebody gives me like 20 pages of like information dump because of like they did all this research on like ships or whatever, and I'm like, I don't need to know it. Like I want to know where the story's going. And so I think for me, I tried my best to, when there are details mentioned, I tried my best to make sure that they were things that would be in line with Sekyung's consciousness or POV at that particular moment, right? So, so for example, if she walks into some really rich person's home, the rich person who lives inside that home might not notice every single detail because that person lives there. Do you know what I mean? Like how many of us walk around our house and like be like, oh yes, there's that lamp over there, it's got a blue cover. Like we don't, because we live around these things, we don't think about them anymore. But like if she's walking into a space and the whole point is that she's kind of gawking at how much money this particular family has, it would make sense for her to kind of pick out every little detail of this house and then to, interpret each detail through her particular consciousness or through her lens. So yeah, I think that details should not only describe, they should be telling us something about the character and how they, like how they grew up and whatever. Like they should tell us something about the character's mindset and background and all of that.
Right. Well, we're just about near at the end, and someone asked our usual final question in a way, so I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. So we usually ask, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out? I think we covered that in terms of writing career earlier. So I'm wondering if there's one piece of craft advice you might have for a writer just starting out, something to be aware of in their own writing and developing the practice of writing instead of maybe the career of writing.
That's a great question. Okay, craft of writing. Something that I think about a lot is, who is my audience for this book, right? Because I think that it can be very easy for all of us to say, oh, my book is for everybody. But like ultimately, there's no such, like everybody comes to books like with such different backgrounds and experiences and all, that it would be impossible to write a book that is for everybody. And so I think I have to, but I think that thinking about, well, who my audience is, that also helps me determine what things do I need to explain? What things do I not need to explain? What are the things that, like, what are the expectations, that this particular audience might have? So I think that in that sense, thinking about who your audience is can help you sharpen your writing so that I don't know how to put it in any other way. It's it forces you to be a lot more intentional and specific about every single sentence that you write. So like, I'm using an example from Matthew Salisi's book, Craft in the Real World, but it's like, if I'm like, okay, I'm writing a story about Lunar New Year, and I'm expecting most of my audience members to know what Lunar New Year, even if they don't practice it themselves, I expect them to know what Lunar New Year is. When I'm writing, I'm not going to be writing entire paragraphs explaining Lunar New Year. I'm just going to be like, yeah, that, like the characters were celebrating Lunar New Year, period. And so there's a way in which thinking about these things can actually help you refine your writing on the page, because because I think the best decisions in writing are intentional decisions. You want every single word that comes out to be as intentional as possible. So I'll just say that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I will also admit that it took me almost the entire chat to realize that the posters are Firefly references on your wall, and I'm feeling I'm feeling a little proud of myself. And I was like, oh, why does this sound familiar? And like, oh, there we go. The TV show Firefly, for those who don't know it. Please, please, please get a copy of the book if you're able. Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea is wonderful in so many different ways. It's an adventure. It's a beautiful novel, and it's just wonderful writing. And Rita, thank you so much for joining us and talking about it today.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming.
Have a good night, everyone. See you again soon.